The rain kissed the cobblestones of Montmartre like a lover's gentle promise, and Josephine Hart pressed her paint-stained fingers against the cold window of her tiny studio. She had exactly 3 francs to her name, a half-empty bottle of turpentine, and a dream that Paris seemed determined to crush beneath its beautiful, indifferent heel. But tonight, as the gaslights flickered to life across the city, something whispered that her life was about to change forever. Josephine was 26, though the mirror often convinced her she looked older. Years of squinting at canvases in poor light had etched fine lines around her green eyes, and her auburn hair, always escaping its pins, gave her a perpetually disheveled appearance that society ladies found charming in theory but unsuitable for their portrait artist. She painted what she saw, not what vanity demanded, and that honesty had left her nearly penniless. The knock at her door came precisely at 8, as the letter had promised. She smoothed her worn skirt and opened it to find a man who seemed to have stepped from another century entirely. Gabriel Rousseau stood perhaps 40 years old, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that whispered of old money, with dark hair silvering at the temples and eyes the color of smoke after rain. But it was his hands that caught her attention, elegant, unmarked by labor, yet trembling ever so slightly. Mademoiselle Hart, his voice carried the warmth of aged cognac. Thank you for agreeing to see me at such an unusual hour. Your letter mentioned urgency. Josephine stepped aside, suddenly conscious of her studio's shabby gentility. And a generous commission. Please, come in. Gabriel moved through her space with careful reverence, studying the portraits lining her walls. These were her failures, the 2 honest paintings that clients had rejected. A banker with sadness in his eyes. A bride with doubt shadowing her smile. A child who knew too much too soon. You paint truth, he said finally, turning to face her. That's precisely why I've come. I need you to paint me as I truly am. Josephine gestured to her threadbare chair, the only decent seat in the room. Most people want flattery, monsieur. Truth is rarely kind. I'm not most people. He sat, his posture perfect yet somehow weighted. And I suspect neither are you. Tell me, did your grandmother ever speak of her work? The question struck like a physical blow. Josephine steadied herself against her easel. My grandmother died when I was 12. How could you possibly know about her? Gabriel reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather journal, its cover worn soft with age. He placed it on the table between them with extraordinary care. Because 30 years ago, Marguerite Beaumont painted my portrait. And what she saw in me changed both our lives forever. Josephine's hands shook as she opened the journal. Inside, her grandmother's familiar handwriting filled the pages, but the words made no sense. Prophecies. Visions. Warnings about seeing too much, painting too deeply, letting the gift consume you. And there, tucked between the pages, a small sketch of a young man who could only be Gabriel, decades younger, with a note in the margin, he carries tomorrow in his eyes. God help him. I don't understand, Josephine whispered, though somewhere deep inside, she did. Those moments when she painted and saw beyond the surface, glimpsed futures in the curve of a mouth, tragedies in the set of shoulders, she had always dismissed them as artistic intuition. What are you asking me to do? Gabriel leaned forward, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his expression. Your grandmother had a gift, mademoiselle. She could paint not just what is, but what will be. She saw it in me, this ability to glimpse tomorrow, and she tried to warn me of its cost. I didn't listen. Now I'm running out of time, and I need to know if the gift passed through her blood to you. That's impossible. I'm just a portrait artist who can barely afford paints. Then paint me, he challenged softly. Paint me as you truly see me, hold nothing back, and we'll discover together whether impossibility is merely another word for potential. Something in his words struck a chord deep in Josephine's soul. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps it was the way the lamplight caught his profile and she suddenly saw not one man but 1,000 versions of him, spreading out like ripples on water. Past and future, hope and ruin, all contained in one mysterious stranger who claimed to have known her grandmother. "I'll need 3 sessions," she heard herself say. "And payment in advance." Gabriel smiled, and it transformed his face entirely. "You'll have both. Shall we begin tomorrow at sunset?" After he left, Josephine stood alone in her studio, her grandmother's journal clutched to her chest. She should have been terrified. She should have dismissed him as a madman. Instead, she pulled out her finest canvas, the one she'd been saving for something special, and began to sketch preliminary studies by candlelight. She didn't notice when the sketch of Gabriel's eyes began to shimmer with colors that hadn't existed in her paint box. She didn't see when the shadows around his portrait deepened of their own accord, taking shapes that whispered of danger approaching. But when she finally fell into bed at dawn, exhausted and exhilarated, her dreams filled with images of a grandmother she'd barely known, painting frantically in a studio much like this one, trying desperately to change a future she'd seen too clearly. The canvas waited. Tomorrow would bring answers. And Josephine Hart, who had spent her whole life painting truth, was about to discover that some truths were never meant to be captured in oil and pigment, because they had the power to change destiny itself. The sunset painted Paris in shades of amber and blood when Gabriel returned. Josephine had spent the day preparing her palette with unusual colors, deep purples that seemed to pulse with inner light, silvers that caught reflections of things not quite present, and a peculiar shade of blue she'd mixed without conscious thought. Her hands moved as if guided by memory not her own. "You've been reading the journal," Gabriel observed, settling into position by the window. It wasn't a question. "My grandmother wrote about visions." Josephine began sketching his outline, her charcoal moving with unsettling confidence. She claimed she could see the threads of fate in people's faces. She called it a curse disguised as a gift. Marguerite was wise beyond her years. Gabriel's expression grew distant. "She painted my portrait when I was 23, full of ambition and ignorance. In that painting, she captured something I couldn't see, a darkness that would consume everyone I loved. She begged me to change my path, but I dismissed her as a talented eccentric. Within 5 years, everything she'd painted had come to pass." Josephine's hand stilled. "What happened?" "My wife died in childbirth. My business partner betrayed me. My closest friend took his own life after losing everything in an investment I'd recommended. Every tragedy, every loss, Marguerite had seen it all and tried to warn me." His voice cracked slightly. "When I finally understood, I sought her out again. But she'd already passed, and her gift had died with her. Or so I thought. Until you found me." Josephine resumed painting, adding layers of color that seemed to breathe on the canvas. "But why now, after all these years?" Gabriel met her eyes with terrible honesty. "Because I've seen my own death, mademoiselle. Not in a painting, but in mirrors, in windows, in every reflective surface. The same face your grandmother painted all those years ago, aged and afraid, with exactly 30 days remaining. That portrait was dated 3 months from now. I have been watching the calendar with dread." The brush slipped from Josephine's fingers, leaving a streak of violet across the canvas that looked disturbingly like a wound. "You want me to paint your future to see if it's changed. I want you to paint my future to see if it can be changed." He stood, moving closer to examine her work. Then he froze, his face draining of color. "Mon Dieu! You've already begun." Josephine looked at her canvas and gasped. She'd painted Gabriel, yes, but not as he sat before her. This Gabriel stood in a darkened gallery, surrounded by portraits that wept color like blood. Behind him, a figure in shadows reached out with hands that ended in brushes instead of fingers. And in the corner of the painting, barely visible, a date, exactly 28 days from tonight. "I didn't mean to paint that," she whispered. "My hands just moved." "The gift," Gabriel breathed. "It's awakening in you, just as it did in Marguerite. You're seeing what I cannot, the precise nature of the threat. Over the next week, Josephine painted with feverish intensity. Each session revealed new details. The shadowy figure became clearer, a woman, ancient and elegant, with eyes that held centuries. The gallery was real, somewhere in the Marais district. And the weeping portraits were not metaphorical, they were literally bleeding, their subjects' futures being drained away. Her name is Madame Delacroix, Gabriel finally admitted on their 5th session. She's a collector, but not of paintings. She collects abilities like ours. I've been running from her for 15 years, ever since I discovered what she truly is. What is she? A thief of destiny. Gabriel's hands clenched. She doesn't just see the future, she steals it, absorbs it, uses it to extend her own life indefinitely. Every person with prophetic ability she's ever found has either joined her willingly or died mysteriously. Their gifts become hers. Josephine felt ice spread through her veins. And she knows about me now. Because I've been painting you. The moment you touched brush to canvas with true sight, she would have felt it. It's like a beacon to her kind. Gabriel moved to the window, his silhouette tense against the dying light. I should never have involved you. I was selfish, desperate to change my fate, and now I've marked you for the same doom. But something fierce had awakened in Josephine over these sessions. She'd spent her entire life painting safely, avoiding the deep truths that frightened clients away. Her grandmother had died alone, her gift unuttered and unexplored. And now this stranger, this beautiful damaged man who carried tomorrow in his eyes, was trying to protect her by pushing her away. No, she said firmly. You came to me because you believed the gift could change destiny. So let's change it. Let's paint a different future. Gabriel turned, hope and fear warring in his expression. It's not that simple. Marguerite tried to change what she saw, and it drove her mad. The future doesn't appreciate being rewritten. Then we won't rewrite it. We'll paint over it. Josephine pulled out a fresh canvas, the largest she owned. You said Madame Delacroix collects abilities by draining them from prophetic portraits. What if we created a portrait so powerful, so true, that it couldn't be drained? What if we painted not what will be, but what could be? You're talking about painting possibility itself. Josephine, no one has ever attempted such a thing. My grandmother never had a partner who could see futures. You perceive tomorrow, and I can capture it. Together, we might be able to create something neither of us could achieve alone. She began mixing colors with renewed purpose. Tell me everything you see when you look at me. Gabriel hesitated, then spoke softly. I see a woman who's been afraid of her own power her entire life. I see someone who paints truth but has never painted her own. And I see. He paused, something vulnerable crossing his features. I see someone who could either save me or doom us both, and I find I don't care which, as long as we face it together. The words hung between them like a confession. Josephine felt her heart race, not with fear but with recognition. In 1 week, this mysterious stranger had seen her more clearly than anyone in her 26 years. And she had seen him, truly seen him, past the elegant facade to the terrified, hopeful soul beneath. Then let's paint us both, she whispered. Not separately, but together. A double portrait showing not what Madame Delacroix expects, but what she fears. And what would she fear? Josephine smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes. 2 people who refuse to let destiny be stolen. 2 artists who paint their own tomorrow. They worked through the night, Gabriel describing visions while Josephine translated them into color and form. The painting that emerged was unlike anything either had imagined. It showed them standing back to back in that same dark gallery. But they were painting on the walls, covering Madame Delacroix's collection with new images, futures reclaimed, possibilities restored. And in the corner, where the date of Gabriel's death should have been, there was only a sunrise. As dawn broke over Paris, they stood before the completed canvas, exhausted and exhilarated. The painting seemed to pulse with its own light, as if the futures it contained were trying to break free and become real. "It's beautiful," Gabriel murmured. "But will it work?" "I don't know," Josephine admitted. "But I know we can't hide from her. If Madame Delacroix is coming for us, we need to control where and when we face her." Gabriel nodded slowly. "The gallery in the Marais. I know the one from your painting. It's where she keeps her collection, every stolen future, every drained gift. If we're going to confront her, it should be there, in the heart of her power." "When?" He checked his pocket watch with a grim smile. "According to your painting, 21 days from now. But I suggest we don't wait for destiny's schedule. Let's write our own." The gallery stood on a narrow street in the Marais, its windows dark despite the afternoon sun. Josephine clutched her painting supplies, feeling the weight of the double portrait rolled carefully in canvas beneath her arm. Beside her, Gabriel's face was set with determination, though she noticed his hands had finally stopped trembling. They'd spent 2 weeks preparing, researching Madame Delacroix through Gabriel's network of expatriates and artists who'd encountered her over the decades. The stories painted a terrifying picture: a woman who'd been stealing prophetic abilities since the French Revolution, who appeared in the background of paintings from a dozen different eras, always watching, always waiting. She didn't force people to surrender their gifts, she made them want to, promising relief from the burden of seeing too much, knowing too much. "She'll offer you an escape," Gabriel had warned during their planning. "She'll show you all the terrible futures you'll paint if you keep the gift, all the madness that consumed your grandmother. And part of you will want to surrender it, because she's right. The gift is a burden." Now, standing before the gallery's ornate door, Josephine understood. Since awakening her ability fully, she'd been plagued by visions. She saw the baker's daughter dying of consumption in 3 years. She glimpsed the flower seller losing her sight before winter. Everywhere she looked, tragedy unfolded in watercolor previews. The weight of knowing, of being unable to prevent every sorrow, pressed down like stones on her chest. The door opened before they could knock. Madame Delacroix stood framed in golden light, looking exactly as Josephine had painted her, ageless beauty with ancient eyes, wearing a gown of deepest burgundy that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Her smile was warm, welcoming, terrible. "Gabriel, mon cher, how wonderful that you've finally come home. And you've brought me a gift, little Marguerite's granddaughter. I've been waiting for you, ma petite." Her voice carried the music of centuries. "Please, come in. Let me show you my collection." The gallery interior stole Josephine's breath. Hundreds of portraits lined the walls, each one radiating a faint luminescence. But as she looked closer, her stomach turned. The paintings were dying. Colors faded even as she watched, faces becoming indistinct, futures being slowly erased. And in the center of the room, Madame Delacroix glowed with stolen vitality, fed by the dying visions surrounding her. "Beautiful, is it not?" Madame Delacroix gestured to her collection. Each one a future saved from the burden of knowing. "These artists were suffering, you understand. The gift your grandmother possessed, that you've now awakened, it destroys as much as it reveals. I simply offer release." "You offer theft," Gabriel said coldly. "You drain their abilities and leave them hollow. I offer peace." Madame Delacroix moved to a portrait of a young woman, touching it gently. The painting's colors bled toward her fingers like water flowing downhill. "This artist saw her own death 1,000 times before I freed her. Now she paints landscapes, happy and ordinary, without the curse of prophecy. Is that not kindness?" Josephine felt the pull of those words. How easy it would be to surrender the visions, to paint only what was in front of her, to stop carrying the weight of everyone's possible tomorrows. But then she looked at Gabriel, standing tall despite his fear, and remembered what they'd created together, not just a painting, but a possibility. "You're wrong," Josephine heard herself say. "The gift isn't a curse. It's a choice. She began to unroll their double portrait, securing it to an empty easel Gabriel had positioned in the center of the room. Madame Delacroix's expression flickered with interest, then alarm, as she recognized what she was seeing. "What have you done?" The ancient woman moved closer, her composure cracking. "This painting, it's impossible. You've woven two prophetic abilities together, created a vision that exists outside of time. We've painted what could be instead of what will be," Josephine explained, her hands steady now as she set out her paints. "You steal finished futures, completed destinies. But this painting isn't finished. It's still being created." Gabriel stepped forward, his voice ringing with conviction. "Every person in this room gave you their gift because they saw only one future, the terrible weight of knowing. But Josephine and I have painted multiple futures, infinite possibilities. You can't drain what hasn't been completed." Madame Delacroix's beautiful face twisted with rage and, surprisingly, fear. "You foolish children. Do you think you're the first to try this? I've consumed a dozen prophetic partnerships. Your painting will feed me just as well as any other." "Then try," Josephine challenged, picking up her brush. "Try to drain a future that we're actively painting into existence." The ancient collector reached toward their canvas, her fingers extending like hooks. The painting's surface rippled, colors beginning to flow toward her as they had with all the others. But Josephine was ready. She dipped her brush in the silver paint she'd prepared, mixed with her own blood, blessed by a priest Gabriel had found, consecrated by their combined intention, and added a single stroke to the painting. The stroke became a line of light that shot through the canvas and into Madame Delacroix's reaching hand. The woman screamed, a sound of pure fury, as the light traveled up her arm and into her body. The gallery shook. Paintings fell from walls. And then, like a dam breaking, all the stolen colors began to flow backward. "What are you doing?" Madame Delacroix shrieked, clutching at the light now pouring from her like arterial blood. "Returning what you stole," Gabriel said, moving to stand beside Josephine. He took a brush, adding his own stroke to the painting, a sunrise that blazed across the canvas with impossible radiance. "Every future you drained, every destiny you consumed, we're painting them free." The gallery became a storm of color. Reds and blues and golds swirled through the air, returning to their original portraits. The dying paintings blazed back to life, their subjects' futures restored. Madame Delacroix aged before their eyes, centuries of stolen time releasing all at once. She collapsed to her knees, no longer ancient and terrible, but simply old, tired, afraid. "Please," she whispered, reaching toward them. "Don't leave me with nothing. The weight of my own future, seeing my own end, I can't bear it." Josephine felt compassion stir, surprising her. She knelt beside the broken woman, looking into eyes that had seen too much for too long. "Then don't see your end. See your choices. The gift was never meant to show only one path." With gentle hands, Josephine painted on the empty canvas Madame Delacroix had become, not a future, but a possibility. An old woman in a small cottage, painting flowers, ordinary and free. It was a gift, not a prophecy. A hope, not a certainty. Madame Delacroix stared at the vision Josephine had created, tears streaming down her weathered face. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I had forgotten," she breathed. "Forgotten that the gift was meant to illuminate choice, not eliminate it. Merci, ma petite. You've taught this old thief a final lesson." She faded like morning mist, not dying but simply releasing her grip on stolen time. The gallery emptied of her presence, leaving only the restored paintings glowing softly in the dimming light. Josephine and Gabriel stood together before their double portrait, which now showed them not in a dark gallery, but in a sunlit studio, painting side by side, futures and possibilities spreading around them like wings. The date in the corner had changed, not to a specific day, but to a simple phrase: "Every tomorrow you choose to create." "Is it over?" Josephine asked, suddenly exhausted. Gabriel took her paint-stained hand in his. "No, I think it's just beginning. We've proven that prophecy doesn't have to be prison. We can paint futures instead of being painted by them." They left the gallery as evening fell, carrying their canvas between them. Behind them, the restored portraits would find their way back to their creators, futures returned, choices restored. The gift Marguerite Beaumont had feared and fled from had been transformed in her granddaughter's hands, not erased, but redeemed. In the weeks that followed, Josephine and Gabriel established something new, a studio where they taught others with prophetic gifts to paint possibility instead of inevitability. Word spread quietly through artistic circles of the woman who painted choice and the man who saw tomorrow, working together to help people rewrite their destinies one brushstroke at a time. On a spring morning 6 months later, Josephine stood in their shared studio, painting Gabriel's portrait once more. But this time, she painted him laughing, surrounded by students, with silver threading his hair and joy lighting his eyes. It was both prophecy and promise, vision and vow. "Will that future come true?" he asked, watching over her shoulder. She smiled, adding one final touch, herself in the painting's background, painting her own tomorrow. "Only if we choose to paint it into existence, every single day." Gabriel wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Then let's choose wisely." And in the corner of the canvas, where once a date of death had appeared, there was now only a phrase that would become their shared motto, passed down to every student who walked through their door: "The future is not a portrait to be copied, but a canvas to be created." Josephine Hart, who had once been a struggling artist painting unwanted truths, had become something far greater, a painter of possibilities, a creator of chosen tomorrows. And Gabriel Rousseau, who had run from destiny for 15 years, had finally learned to stand still and paint his own. Together, they proved that prophecy need not be prison, that seeing the future was not a curse but an invitation, that every tomorrow was simply today's blank canvas, waiting for the courage to make the first stroke. The gift had been redeemed. The choice was theirs. And the painting would never truly be finished, because the best futures are the ones we create with every passing moment, every brave decision, every stroke of love and possibility on the endless canvas of time.